a stubby, silent man of goodly girth, his round head topped with a steeple hat, the skirts of his belted coat and flaps of his petticoat trousers meeting at the tops of heavy boots, and the face, green and ghastly, with unmoving eyes that glimmered in the twilight like phosphorus. The dwarf carried a keg, and on receiving an intimation in a sign that he would like Rip to relieve him of it, that cheerful vagabond shouldered it and marched on up the mountain. At nightfall they emerged on a little plateau where a score of men in the garb of long ago, with faces like that of Rip's guide, and equally still and speechless, were playing bowls, the balls sometimes rolling over the plateau's edge and rumbling down the rocks with a boom like thunder. A cloaked and snowy bearded figure, watching aloof, turned like the others and gazed uncomfortably at the visitor who now came blundering in among them. Rip was at first for making off, but the sinister glare in the circle of eyes took the run out of his legs, and he was not displeased when they signed to him to tap the keg and join in a draught of the ripest schnapps that he had ever tasted. And he knew the flavour of every brand in Catskill. Whilst these men grew no more genial with passing of the flagons, Rip was pervaded by a satisfying glow, then overcome by sleepiness, and resting his head on a stone, he stretched his tired legs out and fell to dreaming. Morning, sunlight and leaf shadow were dappled over the earth when he awoke, and rising stiffly from his bed with compunction in his bones, he reached for his gun. The already venerable implement was so far gone with rot and rust that it fell to pieces in his hand, and looking down at the fragments of it, he saw that his clothes were dropping from his body in rags and mould, while a white beard flowed over his breast. Puzzled and alarmed, shaking his head ruefully as he called the Canis of the Silent, he hobbled down the mountain as fast as he might for the grip of his rheumatism on his knees and elbows, and entered his native village. What? Was this Catskill? Was this the place that he left yesterday? Had all of these houses sprung up overnight, and these streets been pushed across the meadows in a day? The people too. Where were his friends? The children who had romped with him, the rotund topers whom he had left cooling their hot noses in pewter pots at the tavern door, the dogs that used to bark a welcome, recognising in him a kindred spirit of vagrancy. Where were they? And his wife, whose athletic arm and agile tongue had half disposed him to linger in the mountains, how happened that she was not awaiting him at the gate? But gate there were none in the familiar place. An unfenced yard of weeds and ruined foundation wall were there. Rip's home was gone. The idlers jeered at his bent, lean form, his snarl of beard and hair, his disreputable dress, his look of grieved astonishment. He stopped instinctively at the tavern, for he knew that place in spite of its new sign. An officer in blue regimentals and a cocked hat replacing the crimson George III of his recollection, and labelled General Washington. There was a quick gathering of ne'er-do-wells, of tavern haunters and gaping prentices about him, and though their faces were strange and their manners rude, he made bold to ask if they knew such and such of his friends. Nick Vedder, he's dead and gone these 18 years. Brom Dutcher, he joined the army and was killed at Stony Point. never came back. He probably fell over a cliff, or was carried off by Indians, or eaten by bears. 20 years ago, truly it was so. Rip had slept for 20 years without awaking. He had left a peaceful colonial village. He returned to a bustling Republican town. How he eventually found among the oldest inhabitants, some who admitted that they knew him. How he found a comfortable home with his married daughter and the son who took after him so kindly. How he recovered from the effect of the tidings that his wife had died of apoplexy. In a quarrel, how he resumed his seat at the tavern tap and smoked long pipes, and told long yarns for the rest of his days, were matters of record up to the beginning of this century. And a strange story Rip had to tell, for he had served as a cupbearer to the dead crew of the Half Moon. He had quaffed a cup of Hollands with no other than Henry Hudson himself. Some say that Hudson's spirit had made its home amidst these hills, that it may look into the lovely valley that he discovered. But others hold that every 20 years he and his men assemble for a revel in the mountains, that so charmed them when first seen swelling against the western heavens, and the liquor they drink on this night has the bane of throwing any mortal who lips it into a slumber whence nothing can arouse him until the day dawns, when the crew shall meet again. As you climb the east front of the mountains by the old carriage, you pass, halfway up the height, the stone that Rip Van Winkle slept on, and may see that it is slightly hollowed by his form. The ghostly revellers are due in the Catskills in 1909, and let all tourists who are among the mountains in September of that year beware of accepting liquor from strangers. The next story I will read is called A Trapper's Gas Vengeance. About a mile back from the Hudson at Coxsackie stood the cabin of Nick Wolsey, who in the last century was known to the river settlements as a hunter and trapper of correct aim, shrewdness, endurance, and taciturn habit. For many years he lived in this cabin alone, except for the company of his dog. But while visiting a camp of Indians in the wilderness, he was struck with the engaging manner of one of the girls of the tribe. He repeated the visit. He found cause to go to the camp frequently. He made presents to the father of the maid, and at length won her consent to be his wife. The simple marriage ceremony of the tribe was performed, and Wolsey led Minnie to his home, but the wedding was interrupted in an almost tragic manner, for a surly fellow who had loved the girl, yet who never had found courage to declare himself, was wrought to such a jealous fury at the discovery of Wolsey's good fortune that he sprang at him with a knife and would have dispatched him on the spot, had not the white man's faithful hound leaped at his throat and borne him to the ground. She's munching now. Wolsey disarmed the fellow and kicked and cuffed him to the edge of the wood, while the whole company shouted with laughter at his punishment and approved it. A year or more passed. Wolsey and his Indian wife were happy in their free and simple life, happy, too, in their little babe. Wolsey had seldom absent from his cabin for any considerable length of time, and usually returned to it before the night set in. One evening he noticed that the grass and twigs were bent near his house by some passing foot that with the keen eye of his woodsman he saw were not his wife's. Some hunter, he said, saw the house when we passed here, and as belike he never saw one before, he stopped to look in, for the trail led to his window and diverged thence to the forest forest again. A few days later, as he was returning, he came on the footprints that were freshly made, and a shadow crossed his face. On nearing the door, he stumbled on the body of his dog, lying rigid on the ground. "How did this happen, Minnie?" he cried as he flung open the door. The wife answered in a low voice, "Oh, hush, you'll wake the child." Nick Wolsey entered the cabin and stood as turned to marble. Minnie, his wife, sat on the cold hearth, her face and hands cut and blackened, her dress torn, her eyes glassy, a meaningless smile on her lips. In her arms she pressed the body of her infant, its dress soaked with blood, and the little head of the creature lay on the floor beside her. She crooned softly over the cold clay as if hushing to sleep, and when Wolsey at length found words, she only whispered, "Hush, you will wake him." The night went heavily on, day dawned, and the crooning became lower and lower. Still, through all that day the bereft woman rocked to and fro upon the floor, and the agonized husband hung about her, trying in vain to give comfort, to bind her wounds, to get some explanation of the mystery that confronted him. The second night set in, and it was evident that it would be the last for Minnie. Her strength failed until she allowed herself to be placed on the couch of skins, while the body of her child was gently lifted from her arms. Then, for a few brief minutes, her reason was restored, and she found words to tell her husband how the Indian whose murderous attack he had thwarted at the wedding had come to the cabin, shot the dog that had rushed to defend the place, beat the woman back from the door, tore the baby from its bed, slashed its head off with a knife, and flinging the little body into her lap, departed with the words, "This is my revenge, I am satisfied." Before the sun was in the east again, Minnie was with her baby. Wolsey sat for hours in the ruin of his happiness, his breathing alone proving that he was alive, and when at last he arose and went out of the house, there were neither tears nor outcry. He saddled his horse and rode off to the westward. At nightfall he came to the Indian village where he had won his wife, and relating to the assembled tribe what had happened, he demanded that the murderer be given up to him. His demand was readily granted, whereupon the white man advanced on the cowering wretch, who had confidently expected the protection of his people, and with the quick fling and jerk of a rawhide rope bound his arms to his side. Then casting a noose around his neck and tying the end of it to his saddle bow, he set off for the Hudson. All that night he rode, the Indian walking and running at the horse's heels, and next day he reached his cabin. Tying his prisoner to a tree, the trapper cut a quantity of young willows, from which he fashioned a large cradle-like receptacle. In this he placed the culprit face upward, and tied so stoutly that he could not move a finger. Then going into his house, he emerged with the body of Minnie and laid it face downward on the wretch, parsing in appeal, then in harsh and dreadful laughter. That was quite a sad little one. A little story here called The Monster Mosquito. They have some pretty big mosquitoes in New Jersey and on Long Island, but if report of their ancestry is true, they have degenerated in size and voracity, for the grandfather of all mosquitoes used to live in the neighbourhood of Fort Onondaga, New York, and sallying out whenever he was hungry would eat an Indian or two and pick his teeth with their ribs. The Indians had no arms that could prevail against it, but at last the holder of heavens, hearing their cry for aid, came down and attacked the insect. Finding that it had met its match, the mosquito flew away so rapidly that its assailant could hardly keep it in its sight. It flew around the Great Lake, then turned eastward again. It sought help vainly of the witches that brooded in the sinkholes or green lakes, and had reached the salt lake of Onondaga, where its pursuer came up and killed it, the creature piling the sand into hills in its dying struggles. As its blood poured upon the earth, it became small mosquitoes that gathered about the holder of the heavens and stung him so sorely that he half repented the service that he had done to men. The Tuscaroras say that it was one of two monsters that stood on opposite banks of the Seneca River and slew all men that passed. Hiawatha killed the other one. On their reservation is a stone marked by the form of the skyholder that shows where he rested during the chase, while his tracks were until lately seen south of the Syracuse, alternating with footprints of the mosquito, which were shaped like those of a bird and 20 inches long. At Brighton, New York, where these marks appeared, they were reverentially renewed by the Indians for many years. That would be disgusting. That would be disgusting. Little mosquitoes are bad enough. I don't want a giant one. Another little story is called Pollys Lover. In about the middle of this century, a withered woman of 90 was buried from a now deserted house in White Plains, New York. Polly Carter, the name of her, but Crazy Polly was what her neighbours called her, for she was eccentric and not fond of company. Among the belongings of her house was a tall clock, such as relic hunter's prize, that ticked solemnly in a landing on the stairs. For a time during the Revolution, the house stood within the British lines, and as her father was a colonel in Washington's army, she was left almost alone in it. The British officers respected her sex, but they had an unpleasant way of running in unannounced and demanding entertainment in the King's name, which she felt forced to grant. One rainy afternoon the door was flung open, then locked on the inside, and she found herself in the arms of a stalwart, handsome lieutenant who wore the blue. It was her cousin and fiancé. Their glad talk had not been going long when there came a rousing summons at the door. 3 English officers were awaiting admittance. Perhaps they had seen Lawrence Carter go into the house, and if caught he would be killed as a spy. He must be hidden, but in some place they would not think of looking. The clock, that was the place. With a laugh and a kiss, the young man submitted to be shut in this narrow quarter, and throwing his coat and hat behind some furniture, the girl admitted the officers, who were wet and surly and demanded Polly served them with a dinner as quickly as possible, for she wanted to get them out of the house, but they were in no mood to go, and the bottle passed so often that before the dinner was over they were noisy and tipsy and were using language that drove Polly from the room. At last, to her relief, she heard them preparing to leave the house, but as they were about to go, the senior officer, looking up at the landing, now dim in the paling light, said to one of the officers, "See what time it is." The officer addressed, who happened to be the drunkest of the party, staggered up the stair and exclaimed, The damn thing stopped." Then, as if he thought it was a good joke, he added, "It'll never go again." Drawing his sabre, he gave the clock a careless cut and ran the blade through the panel of the door. After this, the three passed out. When their voices had died in distant brawling, Polly ran to release her lover. Something thick and dark was creeping from beneath the clock case. With trembling fingers, she pulled open the door, and Lawrence, her lover, fell heavily towards her in her arms, dead. The officer was right. The clock never went again. Poor Polly. Another little story I'll do is called Francis Woolcott's Night Riders. In Quebec, New York, among the Berkshire Hills, less than a century ago, lived Francis Woolcott, a dark, tall man with protruding teeth, whose sinister laugh used to give his neighbours a creep along their spine. He had no obvious trade or calling, but the farmers feared him so that he made no trouble in making levies. Pork, flour, meal, cider, he could have what he chose for the asking, for had he not halted horses at the plough so that neither blows nor commands could move them for 2 hours, had he not set Farmer Rot's pigs to walking on their hind legs and trying to talk, when he shouted "Up, up, up" to Farmer William's children, had they not leaped to the moulding of the parlour wainscot a yard above the floor and only an inch wide, and walked around it, afterwards skipping like birds from chair back to chair back, while the furniture stood as if nailed to the floor, and it was he not the chief of 13 night riders, whose faces no man had seen, nor wanted to see, and whom he sent about the country on errands of mischief every night, when the moon was growing old? As to moons, had he not found a mystic message from our satellite on Mount Riga graven on a meteor? Horses' tails were tied, hogs foamed at the mouth and walked like men, cow gave blood for milk. These night riders met Woolcott in a grove of ash and chestnut trees, each furnished with a stolen bundle of oat straw, and these bundles Woolcott changed to black horses when the night had grown dark enough not to let the way of the change be seen. These horses could not cross streams of water, and on the stroke of midnight they fell to pieces and were oaten sheaves once more, but during their time of action they rushed through woods, bedding their riders safely, and tore like hurricanes across the fields, leaping bushes, fences, even trees, without effort. A smell of sulphur and woolcot was dead. When the watchers went out, the roads were dry, and none of the village had heard wind, rain, or thunder. It was the coming of the fiend. That's a creepy little one. The last little folklore tale I will read is called The Skull in the Wall. A skull is built into the wall above the door of the courthouse at Goshen, New York. It was taken from a coffin unearthed in 1842 when the foundation of the building was laid. People said there was no doubt about it. Only Claudius Smith could have worn that skull, and he deserved to be publicly pilloried in that manner. Before the Revolutionary War, Smith was a farmer in Monroe, New York, and being prosperous enough to feel the king's taxes no burden, to say nothing of his jealousy of the advantage that an independent government would be to the hopes of his poorer neighbours, he declared for the king. After the Declaration of Independence had been published, his sympathies were illustrated in an unpleasantly practical manner by gathering a troop of other Tories about him, and emboldened by the absence of most of the men of his vicinage in the colonial army, he began to harass the country as grievously and foray as the redcoats were doing in open field. He pillaged houses and barns, then burned them. He insulted women. He drove away cattle and horses. He killed several persons who had undertaken to defend their property. His campaigns were managed with such secrecy that nobody knew when or whence to look for him. His murder of Mayor Nathaniel Strong of Blooming Grove roused indignation to such a point that a united effort was made to catch him, a money reward for success acting as a stimulus to the vigilance of the hunters, and at last he was captured on Long Island. He was sent back to Goshen, tried, convicted, and on January 22nd, 1779, was hanged with 5 of his band. The body of the culprits were buried in the jail yard on the spot where the courthouse stands, and old residents identified Smith's skeleton when it was accidentally exhumed by its uncommon size. A farmer from an adjacent town made off with a thigh bone, and a mason clapped mortar into the empty skull and cemented it into the wall, where it long remained. Well, I hope you enjoyed these little stories. A little bit different to the other countries that I've done so far, but I can imagine every country's stories are a little bit different. These were more like factual, well, some of them factual folk tales, but there are still plenty more to go through. Maybe I'll find a different sound and style for next time that I do US stuff. Well, like I say, I hope you enjoyed these little stories. I would, if you're listening, just now, if you're still with me, I just want to take a second